And you have so much to add to your reputation. It's like very intimidating. But my audience is like they're unschoolers, they're homeschoolers, they're unschoolers. Did I say that already? Um, just lots of different alternative types of education. And so I also want to say that a good fraction of my audience are like neurodivergent or parents of children who are neurodivergent. And I also make it a point to have as much representation from as many different socioeconomic levels on this podcast. So just wanted to let you know it's a very diverse listener group.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm so excited to speak with you. And the first question that I ask every guest is really what kind of child were you? And what kind of messaging did you receive from your caregivers, your teachers, and your peers about what kind of student you were?
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So, in terms of what child I was, I think I was very much a rule follower, and I think by traditional measures, I was successful by traditional schooling measures. And my parents are immigrants from Japan, so they came to the U.S. in the 60s. They were both born during World War II, and I think that really influenced a lot of my childhood, obviously. So I grew up in LA, and grew up in very diverse school settings, which was just such a huge gift. I really gained so much from being in really diverse public schools through eighth grade, and just I know so much of my life was really influenced and shaped by the gift of that. So um, that's at least some of my background. Yeah, I'll stop there and let you ask a question or lead out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I know that, you went through public school education at least until eighth grade. And then I know you got a scholarship to go to a really, I mean, the word that comes to mind is like a prestigious, like fancy high school with like lots of resources. So I'm wondering if you can kind of explain or share like what the difference was between your public school experience and then this really fancy high school education.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly, what comes top to mind is just how much the school setting was different. So my public school setting, there were aspects where like the building was falling apart, or the desks were often broken, or different things like that. So certainly, like the just the school setting itself. I think another aspect that was really different was just the number of students. So in my high school, in my private high school experience, like the English classes, I think they had like 18 students or something like that. It was a very small number, and certainly my public school setting had often like twice that number.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very different. Clearly, the demographics of the school, the private high school, and my public school background were extremely different. So
Mm-hmm.
um, the private high school that I went to primarily had Asian and white students, whereas my public school background had just a very representative like student population from LA,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was just a real richness that I experienced in public schools. Certainly, the academic experience at the high school was far beyond what I had gotten in public school. It was jaw-dropping to me, and I was certainly like a real stress case my ninth grade year when I started at the high school. I just never experienced anything like that. Just the amount of homework, and that everyone was doing the homework, and
Mm-hmm.
all of that was really shocking to me. So anyway, that was some of the background I experienced. Certainly, the socioeconomic level was
Yeah.
vastly different, and that was very intimidating to me to go into a private high school setting and being on scholarship, being someone with less means, and feeling intimidated by that. Whereas when I'd come from public school, I'd been, arguably maybe, my parents were middle class, but very much maybe at the upper end. So it was just a real contrast in student experiences and what students, the experiences they had brought, in terms
Mhm.
of world travel and all of that. So that was certainly like some of the differences I experienced.
Two memories come to mind. I had a guest on my podcast recently, and she talked about how, so she grew up in Baltimore, and she grew up in a neighborhood, the east side of Baltimore, where there's a lot more activity there that gets a lot of attention for not being the best. And she was saying that she went to school in a different neighborhood, in a private school, and so she was not able to process what happened to her at home or in her neighborhood with the same type of people that were going to school. And so she kind of almost said, like, it would have been almost better to go to schools where she lived, because then they could at least process the experiences that were happening together in community. So I was wondering for you, like when you do mention that, the people were different, and even though you were kind of like part of the upper middle class, that you did see a lot of differences in the socioeconomic stratospheric, that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering, like, do you remember any kind of stories or people that either you were intimidated by, or you didn't really know how to speak with, or, was there any kind of like, how do I fit into this bubble? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, just one story comes to mind that,
Sure.
um, frequently like the school events or some of the school events, like
Hmm.
even the school dances were hosted by families at my private high school. And so it blew my mind that families had homes that were large enough to
Mm.
host a whole school dance. I mean, the class, I mean, our whole high school was, I think, 320 students,
Okay.
and only a certain number of those would go to school dances. But I remember going to these homes and being really floored that people lived in, what to me just seemed like these mansions that could host a school dance. So that was really surprising. I remember just some other like graduation events where families hosted, like say a senior graduation lunch, and just watching the interactions among families or among
Mm.
the students, my classmates, and just realizing like, oh, I was very much not raised, in that type of setting. I share this story when I'm leading professional development or professional learning, particularly for math teachers, but just in terms of like structures and
Hmm.
um, in our classroom settings. And I share, my wife is her father was a CFO at one point in Silicon Valley, and
Mm.
they're her parents are both from Europe, um, and so when we were engaged or dating, and I would go to their house and we'd sit around their dining room table. And my father-in-law might sit at the head of the table, and my mother-in-law at the other side, and we were sitting in a circle around this table, and he might my father-in-law might just raise a topic about the news or something, and everyone would just start talking. And I contrast it to my childhood, where
Mm.
it felt like more of our dinner was like in front of the TV, or we'd eat at the kitchen table, but it might be at just different points, and just the TV would be on. And so just those types of kind of experiences. And I mostly raise this story when I'm leading professional development because I talk about students who don't get an opportunity or an invitation to come into the space that
Right.
we're we're expecting students to kind of, I don't know, enter in themselves. But frequently, this is just a real cultural bias, and we need to really create space for our students to enter in. And so we need structures in our school system, in our classrooms that really allow for equity of voice and allow for students to enter in to the space to invite, to give opportunity for students to speak, but also for students to listen. That there really needs to be that dynamic at play, that like kind of real balance of speaking and listening, and without explicit structures,
Hmm.
will revert to just our white supremacy dominant culture norms, and those are very much ones in which whoever has the most status and power speaks out, and so um, it speaks out first and often speaks out most, and so anyway, I think there's just so much about that about those dynamics and being aware of them, and so much base right in our background,
Mm.
and so anyway, just asking educators, just statistically that the vast majority of educators, at least in the US, right, are white, and so just the cultural norms that we may assume um, operate for students and operate in our classrooms. I just really want to ask teachers to be mindful of those and to incorporate structures that really allow for equity of voice, particularly for the richness in the diversity of students we have, uh, and being mindful for teachers to use their own power and status within a classroom to really set that forth so students are invited in. Um, so anyway, just reflecting back to your question of just places where
Yeah.
I certainly felt I was not invited in
Right.
necessarily, that felt very uh, just strange to me. Like it was such a whole new world from what I experienced growing up or culturally from my family. And so
Yeah.
anyway, that definitely comes to mind of just being that link of our personal experiences and then linked to the work we do in education. So anyway, that
Yeah.
comes to mind for sure.
Oh my gosh, there's a lot there. And, you really do juxtapose those two worlds. And I think you bridge them very beautifully, not just there, but also in the work that you did subsequently. And are still doing now, I guess. But I would love to know a little bit like about your parents' kind of expectations for you. And was it their hand in like taking you out of public school and, you know, um, trying to get you into a better school, I guess, for lack of a better phrase?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for your question. So it wasn't actually my parents, and maybe this is runs counter to many of the kind of, I don't know, ideas of Asian parents or stereotypes
Yeah.
of Asian parents, but my parents were fairly uninvolved with my schooling or even
Oh,
our activities. And it may have been just a matter of either being immigrants to the US and not really understanding the system, or it may have just been the overwhelm of living in another country in another
mm,
language, all of that. Um, so they were fairly uninvolved with my schooling. So I ended up actually applying to this private high school myself. I
oh,
remember
wow.
calling, yeah, I mean this is back in the day where you call and I remember calling and asking, would you please send me an application? They sent it to me. I remember filling it out and then my parents just signing it and writing it the check for an application. I'm sure they probably did other things that I don't remember, but I remember sending it in. So I think there was just an element in me of like motivation. Um, a teacher at my middle school had actually talked with me about this high school. Her husband
Oh,
had taught
okay.
there, so that was definitely she had also put the idea in my head. But so my parents really were not very involved. I remember even in college, our grades would get sent to us, to the students, and I don't think my parents ever saw them, gratefully, because I think they probably would have had some conversations if they had seen my grades in college. But so they just weren't very
Mm-hmm.
involved in at least the kind of academic world that or my academics. I think they were fairly surprised when I got into Stanford in high school or as a senior because I think they didn't know how I'd been doing in high school. So I think they were fairly surprised. And anyway, and so yeah, that is some of my background. I mean, one other thing maybe I'll share is that I share this during my professional development for math teachers in particular, and I ask teachers to really reflect on their own story and what they bring in, and the ways that that really influences, how we engage in the classroom and how we teach and our relationships with students. Um, so my parents were both born during World War II and experienced a great deal of trauma. So my father never finished middle school just out of just sheer poverty. My mother didn't walk until she was almost 5 years old out of malnourishment. Like there just wasn't food in Japan and post World War II Japan, or um, and so I think they brought so much of that, of course, the trauma of war with them to the U.S. and then subsequently, in our family. And so some of what I share is actually my work in schools and with classrooms or with teachers really is around this model called complex instruction that really looks at status and power issues and dynamics in a classroom. But some of my interest in this I know traces back to my own family and seeing how power and status was really misused or abused. And I would say some of that was cultural, some of it was based in the trauma of war. Um, my father sadly was alcoholic, violent, and bipolar, and that clearly, impacted how he was in our family. And I think that growing up in that environment really made me sensitive to issues of power and status. And so recognizing where I'm very just attuned to where power and status emerges, and because of I think my childhood and I mean after years of therapy and executive coaching and different things, I think working through that, but then s- being able to hopefully like really see this as gift, even though it was very, very hard growing up
Yeah.
in that environment. But now being able to say, I think I'm very sensitive to issues of power and status, particularly in classroom settings, because um, and school settings, and I mean just even all around us in our society, but a lot because of that background, um, and then also then wanting to address those issues and confront those issues. This model, at least out of Stanford complex instruction, some of the premise is that status and power dynamics, unless they're addressed, really get in the way of student learning and student engagement. Um, and so I certainly see that, and because of that, I think my own background and being able to relate around power and status issues, um, and being really able, in some regards, to relate to students who also may have experienced trauma or um, have experienced sort of these power and status dynamics, and they also experience it day to day,
Mm-hmm.
particularly Black and Brown students, really see and experience this day to day. So um, I think there was some level of certainly like camaraderie or of understanding or empathy that both I felt with my students, and I think my students felt with me around this. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is some of the work that I get to take part in schools. And just one other thought on this. Um, I don't want this to sound like it's all touchy-feely and, oh, like power status. It really is about academic outcomes and really seeing
Yeah.
that academic outcomes are, um, that students' academic outcomes are like they increase uh, as we address these power status dynamics. So it's not just let's make a kumbaya setting in our classrooms, but much more like let's address these issues that exist in society and are mirrored in
Mm-hmm.
our classrooms and get in the way of students learning. Um, our whole society, our world is so divided, And what does it look like for us to learn to work across lines of difference or across difference? And what just a fundamental belief that we are really better when we work across lines of difference.
Yeah.
Um, all of us are better. The product, the outcomes are better. Um, but we just don't know how to do that well. And so anyway, that's a lot of, I think, some of the work I get to do and I'm really excited about and very grateful to be part of. And certainly linking it back to my personal history and then and then transitioning that into my professional life as well. So anyway, just being very grateful for that that the
Yeah.
work I get to do.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for sharing that. I think I see how so many things are connected for you. It goes back to the personal, it goes back to the professional, and it also like ties in to the social impact work that you do. So yeah, it's very integrated. And I wanted to share like I also am very sensitive to power dynamics, and I see status all the time. You know, as somebody who has very little of it in society for many different intersectional reasons, like it's very easy to see. And so when you mention that, I I wanted to learn a little bit more about that road that you did take because you did go to Stanford. You also went to Harvard, and you were for 16 years a math teacher. And then I think you went on to get your superintendent's license and go on to, um, found your own practice in training teachers. And like I'm kind of curious about the work that you do and a little bit more about, I guess, how you see what are some of the things that you do in your work that actually translates, like leading with collaboration and connection, that actually leads to results academically?
Yeah, thank you. Can I just build on something you said earlier?
Yeah, of course.
And I appreciate your own reflection about your own status um, and sort of where that is in the world and how that
Mm-hmm.
influences and impacts how you interact. And I think that's so much of the work I get to do with educators is to really ask them to reflect on that and reflect on their own impact and
Mm.
also what has influenced their lives t because we bring that, everywhere we go, obviously, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of our identity and our background, our history, um, all of that. And so how does that enter into particularly the classroom space um,
Mm-hmm.
so that they're mindful? And I think, part of this work that I get to um, like facilitate, looks at these like what are called status interventions. And your sharing just made me think about this work in terms of how we can use our status on behalf of others and
Mm-hmm.
really the need to do that. I mean, both at like a moral level, but also I think to get work done better and well. I share a story in the training during my Harvard doctoral program. One of the professors called me Ken. And I used to go by Ken, so it actually doesn't, it's not I'm just used to it. But in
Mm-hmm.
college, I switched to Kentaro,
Mm.
and but I didn't speak up. And we're in whatever, one of the Harvard, halls or whatever of learning. But my cohort, which was 25 really incredible people, this doctoral cohort, they spoke up on my behalf and they said, "It's Kentaro. It's Kentaro." They kept saying it. And then the professor heard and realized, and he later ended up coming up to me and apologizing, saying, "I know your name, I will use it." But just a place where I felt my own status issues in this classroom environment at Harvard. Um, and this professor not saying my name, and then on behalf of, or on my behalf, my cohort then comes and speaks up for me. And I just think this is something we need to do for each other, and we need to do for our students in particular. And I'm really looking for places where status and power dynamics are getting in the way of students collaborating with each other, working with each other, the ways that they interact or don't interact. What are the ways that we can use our status and power for good and to address all of the issues that are emerging in the classroom spaces and in our own spaces. So anyway, I just want to raise that just places where we ourselves can engage
Mm-hmm.
in addressing this work.
Yeah.
So for each other and for for
Yeah.
adults in the system as well. And then I think your question, if I actually, do you mind asking it one more time? I think it was about connections and relationships. I'm trying to remember, but
Yes,
thank you.
but it's a good thing you asked me because I just wanted to reflect on what you just said. Very relatable, actually, because I went by my middle name, which is Diane, for a long time. And then in college, actually switched to my legal name, which is it's a Chinese name, so it's still not Korean, but still it reflected my Asian heritage. So I just wanted to say I totally understand. Maybe not exactly the same way, but I could very much relate to that. And yes, you're right. So the question that I really wanted to ask you was, um, what was the work that you have been doing since your time at Stanford and Harvard um, around kind of, I guess, changing the paradigm from leading with like this status and power to actually leading with collaboration and connection, and how that's actually impacting the bottom line of not just, connecting with students, but actually helping them rise above academically.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Okay, so just one piece to build off of. So really, the status and power work is very integrated into the collaboration work and the connection
Mm-hmm.
and relationship building. So just to clarify that it's really like all one and the same in this work. I think what has intrigued me. So this concentric math that I launched and run, it's only been about a year or maybe a year and a half.
Mm.
So it's been very recently. But what's been intriguing has been that districts are that have reached out are very much districts who are examining uh, equity within their districts, and particularly wanting to center the work around Black students frequently and centering the work around Black and Brown students. Um, and so I think some of my background, which I'm very grateful for in San Francisco Unified, at Mission High School, and then now I get to work with Cambridge, Massachusetts. Frequently, those two districts are written about in many newspapers, like or the Boston Globe and the San Francisco Chronicle and the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. They talk about at least these two districts in the context of math and around math equity. And it's a very contentious topic right now. There
Mm.
are one of the professors at Stanford, Joe Bowler, who I've gone to work with, has gotten death threats. I mean, it's
Mm.
really this very politically hot. I mean, it's a very there's just so much going on politically.
Mhm.
Okay, so but your question about like connection and outcome. So I think just related to this, when I was at Mission High. Um, I in San Francisco, I was very much like, and I think our department and our school is very much dissatisfied with the outcomes we were seeing among Black and Latinx students, and really asking like, what can we do? Like, this is our responsibility. We're the adults in the system. We've created this. So what is it we can do? And early on in my teaching, just in collaboration with some professors from San Francisco State around an NSF grant, we saw actually there is a way to address the this what people often call the achievement gap, but more this opportunity
Mm-hmm.
gap between white and Asian students and Black and Latinx students. And the work, the way to do that is to detrack, is to make heterogeneous groupings. And what I had inherited at Mission High School was a math department that had an honor section of almost all white and Asian students, and then all the other classes, whatever you call them, regular classes or non-honors or whatever you call them. Sometimes they call them college prep. Um, and those are primarily Black and Latinx students. And there's been research that actually you can address this opportunity gap, make heterogeneous groups, like detrack your classes. Um, but the tricky part is politically, people don't want to do this, and particularly, I would say white and Asian families or families with higher social capital or political capital do not want to do this. They fear um, this detracting for a variety of reasons. They think their own students will not progress as far. I think there's underlying racism that no one wants to really address or talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so we did this work, and it certainly did achieve the outcomes. It was not only that white and Asian students actually increased in their performance, but the Black and Latinx students who had never had access to advanced math courses, AP courses in the US, were getting access and were entering the classroom, succeeding in the classrooms, passing AP math exams. Um, and that was just not, that had not really happened in the school or the district. And so that this work, I think, is very replicable, or it's we can replicate it. Um, and that has been some of the interest in districts that I've gotten to work with through my work, is to say, well, actually, if we want to address this, there is a way. Uh, it's very unpopular and it's very politically charged, and um, and people aren't comfortable with it. And partly it's because mostly all of our experiences, I would argue, the parents, the adults in the system, all of our experiences that we've lived lives of tracking, that our school systems have been tracked, our society is tracked, our communities are tracked. I mean, eh, so because of that, we have this bias that it's not going to work, or um, there's a article, or it's very old. I think it's like 20 plus years old, but by Alfie Kohn. It's something like only for my kids, and sort of this idea of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna fight, but only for my kids. Um, but essentially, by making heterogeneous groupings, it really is everyone benefits. That right now, there's just so much richness that gets just shared among students, and students who would never interact together in the hallways or at lunch, or but it, when we seat them together and they're working, and we set up the classroom um, in a way that really promotes this collaboration across lines of difference, there is so much richness and depth that is shared among students who would never interact otherwise, and also gives an opportunity for students to learn from each other and learn that others who they may have thought do not bring um, what we call smartnesses or competencies to the work do bring a real wealth of smartnesses and competencies to the work. Um, and vice versa. So there's just a lot of like learning opportunity. So I mean, in terms of like, I think you had said like the bottom line and academic outcomes. I within certainly the research, like Joe Bowler did research around this method in the Bay Area, and then I think our work at Mission High School, San Francisco Unified. I think other places that have incorporated this approach certainly have seen outcomes increase. I think one thing that one arena we're looking at in terms of outcomes, even right now with Cambridge and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I do want to just say I really appreciate this district who they're really asking some tough questions and they're
Mm-hmm.
willing to turn the mirror on themselves or the to really like take a look in the mirror about their own practice, their structures, their systems, their policies, which is a lot of the work I get to do with districts. So one of the questions they're even asking is, how many of our Black and Latinx students are getting into AP math classes? How many are staying? Who's leaving, right? And why?
Mm-hmm.
And asking like the question about themselves of like, what is it we may be doing, the adults in the system, the educators, to promote this when Black and Latinx students who need to be in these classes are
Mm-hmm.
asking to leave. And so even that measure of asking who's in these classes, who are in these advanced math classes, and then who's staying and finishing, I think is a really great question. And in collaboration with them of really asking them to look at that data and if students are asking, if Black and Latinx students in particular are asking to leave an advanced math course that they've worked so hard to get to, like why? Like
Mm-hmm.
what's happening and what can we in the system change so that they don't leave, they don't want to leave. So anyway, let me stop there and feel free to
Well,
lead out.
I was hoping you would share a little bit more about if there are any like preliminary hypotheses of why they're leaving that you know of.
So one of the teachers in Cambridge in one of the trainings brought up publicly, so I feel comfortable saying this
Okay.
publicly. She asked within the Cambridge Ringe and Latin, within the high school, why are 80% of the AP math teachers white male, and why are 80% of the Algebra 1 teachers, which is the kind of starting level, the lowest level in ninth grade math, why are 80% of them white female? And this came in the training that I do with districts towards the end of the week, where we ask about status in our own system and or within the system of adults,
Mm-hmm.
like and how does that look in our own work? And so a question is if we're the adults promoting status and power dynamics within the adult system, of course, it's going to get replicated among the students. And that's just some of the research from my advisor at Harvard, Joel Mehta, and or this sort of like just this replication in the system. But also then I mean the question is which teachers are students, particularly Black and Latinx students, or female students who may not be progressing into advanced math courses for a variety of reasons. Um, like who are the teachers that are most successful with Black and Latinx students and female students in advanced math courses? And then does that need to be does the makeup of who's teaching need to be disrupted? So
Mm-hmm.
Cambridge has actually taken this up and has begun to sort of change some of this and begun to just look at the makeup of um, their of who's teaching what and potentially making it more diverse across the board from algebra through AP math courses. And so I commend them for this courage. It's not many districts who are asking these types of questions and being self-reflective and um, asking questions. I think we just take it like de facto that if you have
Mm-hmm.
seniority, you'll decide
Mm-hmm.
you get all these privileges, but instead they're really asking within the system something else, and what's really going to serve our students best, particularly Black and Brown students, English learners, students with IEPs, and really wanting to center those students, which is also not what we do. Um, so anyway, I think that's an example
Yeah.
of making a structural change um, that would address some of the status power issues, the reasons why students may not progress, and really wanting to learn from students, like what is their experience, and really taking that seriously, and then
Hmm.
wanting to adjust our practice as educators, our structures and systems to make the experience better for students, and then tied to that, then are the outcomes would be better for them. So
Yeah, no, these are really great. And I kind of am thinking of several people on my podcast who I had on, and there's a lot of alignment here. And so, in the first season of my podcast, I one of the key insights was that our mass schooling systems really have like a singular definition of success, and those who can perform to those standards with a certain level of speed and accuracy, they're seen as valuable to society, whereas those who can't perform to those standards are labeled as not valuable. And I'm kind of wondering, with this research around detracking and, the formation of heterogeneous groupings of students working in collaboration and connection with each other, I'm wondering, like, what are some like metrics, I guess, you're using to assess student achievement that's maybe different from like Common Core or,
mhm.
what's actually in public schools right now?
Sure, no, absolutely. So well, just in terms of metrics, I mean, one thing I think we took seriously at Mission High, and I take seriously with districts, is actually that because students are measured, and unfairly so. I mean, I would just say
Mm,
it's unfortunate, but there are still these gatekeepers, the SAT or AP courses, or AP scores, standardized testing, and so even though many of us disagree with those metrics, because students are being measured against them, we have to take them seriously, because I think to not take them seriously is to disadvantage students, and particularly Black and Brown students. And so I think some of what we were really serious about at Mission was to say, no, the students will achieve on these standardized tests that we may disagree with, but we need to prepare them for this, because this is how the system in the US, as much as we may disagree with it, um, our education system, the college admission system, this is how they're
mm,
measured. And so to not prepare them is to disadvantage them. That said, we did. There were other metrics, right? I mean, there are metrics that districts are using. I mean, Cambridge again, is using like a sorry, a social emotional measure of like how are students engaging with math identity, some of the survey questions that are put out to students about their experiences, how are they viewing themselves. So certainly that, I think, I mentioned just for us at Mission, and I think this is something I'm asking more and more districts to just to look at, is, for us, the fourth year math course was an elective course. Students did not need to opt into it. Um, but we found, just as we changed our approach at Mission, that, again, we went from one AP math course to like four or five, that
mm,
students were asking and opting in to take this advanced math course. And so I think for me, that's a huge metric. Like, are students wanting to continue on in math, even when they don't need to? They've met the
Mm.
graduation requirement. I think that's been something that, you know, like I take very seriously, is that there's been research about just when students or take 4 years of math in high school and then they transition to college, like they are so much more successful in college math. And and that's intuitively makes sense. But just that, that students often don't have to take a fourth year math course though. So when they opt into, I think it really speaks volumes.
Mm.
Um, so I think that is a metric. Let me just say one thing, if I could hop back to what you
Yeah,
had said earlier in your question.
of course.
You had just brought up about like traditional measures of math and the ways we look at it, and this has just been something that I've just raised with educators, and I do think, right, like just all these ways we assess students is it's just so ludicrous, right? Like
Yeah.
when do we ever have a situation where we give someone like a piece of paper, a
Yeah.
pencil, a timer, and we're like, here, answer these questions, and this is going to show that you know something. And
Right.
versus, I was just thinking about my son. Was thinking about like changing his room up, like the furniture in his room, and so he and my wife are working on this and they're like, diagramming out the room and they're talking to each other and eh, there's time, there's collaboration. He could use different tools. They could use like a calculator if they want. They could go online. I mean,
Right.
and my wife's offering these different ideas because she's so creative. Um, and I just thought this is like actual real math. Like,
Yeah.
like this is how we use it in the world. I mean, or I was thinking about my college friend who, works at Google and works, as a manager in the quantum AI group or whatever. And I'm like, oh, like when they do math or whatever, like it's like they collaborate about it, they share data, they talk it through. They can, of course, go online for anything, any, but our test taking like situations are just so odd, right? Like it's
Mm.
a piece of paper, or it might be online, but it's timed. It's usually individual. It's like, answer these questions, and this is going to show how to math. And I just think it's just so ludicrous to me, because really when we use math in the world, it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's always in a collaborative environment, or if someone checks
Yeah.
our work, or someone does part of the work. It might be data collection, and someone else interprets the data.
Yeah.
It's very much more of a team effort. And so,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I just think it just points out like how antiquated our school system is,
Yeah.
and also just how out of touch we are, right? So, what does it look like to really set students up to be able to engage in like kind of the real world or real world mathematics, but also
Yeah.
this also just stresses like all the different competencies and smartnesses that we need to operate.
Right.
And so, and that one of the premises of this work in complex instruction is, like we all bring something, but no one brings everything, and that is true, right? Like, so in in the work we do, it's always better, like
Mm-hmm.
when we're collaborating. So the product is always better. So anyway, I just wanted to build
100%.
off of that from your your earlier
No,
part of the question.
yeah, and thank you for sharing that because really the next part that I wanted to ask you about is that collaboration piece or the project, the project, the project-based learning piece, because so I went to an elementary school. So I'm a very tactile learner. I learned this a lot. I mean, I think I actually learned this when I was younger, but I cognitively was made aware of this more recently that I actually code a lot of things into memory when I'm
Hmm.
actually like doing things with my hands. I was an art major and I'm a very creative person. And I think when I'm interacting with people, when I'm interacting with things, it's very hard for me to learn in a classroom setting because 90% of the time I am performing that I'm listening, not actually retaining what I'm listening to. And so you were talking about like, schools being antiquated. And, I mean, first of all, you have been able to help students achieve a lot of success uh, within this antiquated system that we're talking about. I think you even got like the presidential award at the White House, right, for achieving a lot for teaching students and raising test scores and things like that. And so, you have been able to beat the antiquated system and actually make it work. But I'm wondering if we were to sort of like redesign from the ground up and kind of build for people with more diverse competencies and abilities and people who are tactile learners and people with ADHD and all of these things. I'm just kind of wondering, like, how would you recommend that we sort of bring in that project based learning element, kind of like what you were talking about with your son and your wife, where you're like actually diagramming or trying to build this room with the furniture and things like that? Like, how can we do that at scale, do you think?
Yeah, no, thank you for a great question. Just can I go back to just part
Of
of what you brought up,
course.
and then and then I'll try to pivot there. It just
Sure.
burst thinking all your thoughts. I do want to just say or clarify really, because I think the narrative often can be like, oh, you as an individual accomplished this, and I do just very much want to say like it was very much. I know I both had amazing collaborators in terms of math educators, our department, leaders within our school, our district, other schools. Like we did get to work with, Joe Bowler's Railside High. And anyway, I just want to call that out because I want to just say I certainly know, and I know I've built off of the shoulders of many people who've come before me that I feel very like fortunate that I feel like I landed in a great place at Mission High that really changed the trajectory of my career and my life. And it was really people who like came into my life and I just feel very grateful to have been able to collaborate with them and just and maybe that is like this theme of this collaboration work I get to do, like knowing it's not an individual story. It's very much a collective story, and it's just to counter the narrative in our, at least in
Yeah.
the U.S., around rugged individualism. So, very much
Sure.
wanting to call that in. Even
Sure.
Zaretta Hammond, like early on, before she had written her book, she was leading professional learning and development in San Francisco Unified. I mean, Jill Bowler, before she, created this massive, U cubed work and national work. I mean, just that she came to Mission High for a day even. I mean, just this collaboration that I feel like I was very grateful to
Mm-hmm.
engage in. So I just want to call that in right now. And I think it just in terms of your question about the antiquated system and building for people and scale. So I mean, I just want one piece to this work. Like I recognize right now that the system is the way it is and it's antiquated. And generally, the work I do is within the system as it exists. Like I think it
Mm-hmm.
will require so much to change the larger system. I do believe fundamentally um, that there's just an element of almost like our own consciousness. I think there's a quote by Albert Einstein or something about just if we want to change any kind of any issue, any problem in a system, like we have to change our own consciousness because if we maintain the same consciousness with which we've solved our problems, everything's going to stay the same, and we need something else. So I do believe like there is this deeper level within us, within our own like work internally that we need to engage with. So um, there's a researcher at MIT, I think his name is Otto Schormer, and I've just started listening to some of his work, but really around like this consciousness-based systems change. And I've just become intrigued just in the last week, and I'm really intrigued by this work because I do really fundamentally believe the system will change out of a change in like our own consciousness
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and mindfulness. Okay, so that said, in terms of models, from our Harvard program, one of our colleagues, Tyler Thigpen, has started a school. It's called the Forest School. It's self-directed learning, and they asked me to read recently a draft of a book that they're publishing, and I was really taken by it, but because it really looks at sort of this how-to guide around self-directed learning and what does that look like within a school and how do you set up structures and systems. So to really promote that, so students can engage in in that. So certainly there are elements, things like we sort students by grade or by age,
Mm-hmm.
and all of those like just the traditional approaches, and why do we do this, and again like based in the factory model, and our schools
Mm-hmm.
based in the factory model and all of that, and um, so we just have a history, and we do this out of efficiency and out of like cost savings and et cetera, et cetera. So certainly, I think there are models that really look at this. I think, or about how to potentially change the system. I think, not to be a downer, but I think for me, I right now am focusing my work on the existing system
Mm-hmm.
and sort of saying like what are the changes we can enact within the system as it exists.
Mm-hmm.
I think other people, their work is really about changing the structures towards like more like a different vision of it. And I think for me, um, what I'm interested in right now is recognizing the existing system is very full of problems, full of issues, and yet that is where the vast, vast, vast majority of our students in the US
Mm-hmm.
go. And
Mm-hmm.
so, because of that, what is needed to change that? And I mean, going again back to this work by Schormer at MIT, I mean, this consciousness based, I mean, I think there is this level of that is some of it. It's like, can we change the consciousness of educators and
Mm-hmm.
recognize like their role, their impact, and what does that look like uh, within our system, so that we can change experiences and outcomes for our students, particularly Black and Brown students. Um, and what does that look like to be able to do that? And I also just recognize very much I'm also just implicated in all of this work too. Like I have to
Mm-hmm.
constantly interrogate myself
Yeah.
around just ways that I have status and power. I
Mm-hmm.
use and abuse it, and I need to be called out on it. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are people, my wife, friends, colleagues from my Harvard program and others who call me out, and I really appreciate that, and I need that because we're all like part of this problem.
Yeah.
And so anyway, just really I think needing that and needing to really nurture this, if it is this consciousness based change, then I need to nurture that because
Yeah.
I'm getting the privilege of working with so many leaders and educators. But if I'm not aware of that impact, then I'm just perpetuating all the issues
Mm-hmm.
within the system. So anyway, I think just wanting to say that like I very much take this with a lot of responsibility, but also just
Yeah.
recognize like I'm in constant need of this challenge and change. And anyway, I just want to say that.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, I just recently finished taking a course through IDOU, and it's called Human Centered Systems Thinking. and
Hmm.
we one of the reading assignments. Well, it wasn't a reading assignment, but I was reading "Thinking in Systems"
Uh-huh.
by Danella Meadows,
Uh-huh.
and uh, she has like these 12 ways of intervening in a system, going from most effective to least effective. Well, it's in
Mm,
reverse in the way that she's written it. And I think the closer we get to like this consciousness piece that you're talking about,
mm,
that's like, that is probably the biggest lever that you could sort of manipulate to actually achieve systemic change. And so I think you're onto something here about like the mindsets and the behaviors being at that consciousness level of being able to change the thinking. And I know you said you didn't want to be a downer, and you're like sticking with how to change the existing system. And I think everybody is needed in all the different, like everybody is needed, all a hands on deck. And like nurturing the next generation of young people is an all consuming thing, and we need people everywhere doing this work. um, and so I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about that mindset and the behavior. Something that I learned very early on in doing this podcast is what I didn't understand for a long time is that the education system is really designed for the success of the economy. Earlier, you were talking about like the factory model, and how the Industrial Revolution really is what started, um, you know, the education model that we see. Um, and when I realized that, I was like, oh, because that's in direct conflict with the success of every child. Because if the economy's goal is for it to be competitive, and everybody has to know everything, then it really comes at the cost of being able to tailor and nurture the gifts of each child, and lead in connection with, right? Instead of against and competing with. And so I guess like if we are going to kind of like peel back the layers on this consciousness piece that you're talking about, which I'm kind of relating to um, the mindsets and behaviors, I'm wondering, what do you think is the big mindset shift that you're taking, or that you're believing, or that you're working towards changing to within the existing education system? I don't know if that was like a huge ramble, but
No, 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 no. I mean, what comes to mind, I do appreciate the link of just as our education system really set up just to support and uh, maintain and perpetuate the capitalist, system we have, or the economic model of our country and
hmm,
world, or in many ways our world.
right.
And what comes to mind, and I've said this in some conferences where I facilitated sessions, but I really do fundamentally believe that within capitalism, right, there you
Hmm.
have to have like haves and have-nots, or you have to have the
Hmm.
bourgeois and proletariat or whatever. You have
Yeah.
to have various like classes,
Hmm.
and for it to operate, and very much, right, like we set up our school system to have that, within schools, between schools, within, communities, between communities. Um, so very much, that we are perpetuating that, and building towards that. And so I think some of the shift and change, like I hope to be part of with this mindset shift you're raising, or this consciousness um, shift, is really one of asking. I mean, like really getting to students. Like, can students recognize? Can their mindsets be shifted to recognize
Hmm.
sort of what a lot around, I mean, just in terms of like what is it they bring? Because and particularly, students who the messages they've gotten throughout our whole school system has been that they are lacking, that they don't bring anything worthwhile to the system, to education, all of that. And um, I think one of the most beautiful parts of complex instruction and one of the most powerful parts is really, these competencies that are both academic but also, based in like social emotional and, around communication and collaboration. But saying these are competencies that are needed for us to do work and do work well and to really actually go deep into the mathematics, like these are all needed. So I think some of the consciousness or mindset shift is wanting to really instill that in students and build this
Mm,
sense of like student efficacy. Um,
mm,
that's one level, of course, but really also then getting to the educator because I think there is this mindset within educators too of needing that really changed. I think both how they view students,
mm,
particularly how they sort. And I'll include myself. We sort students, we sort others. Um, like I don't want to create a they we like dichotomy. So
mm,
like I want to include myself. So we sort and we have a hierarchy of what's valued, who's valued, what are the
yeah.
traits that are valued. Um, so really wanting to confront that and ask us to change our views around that with the like intention and the hope and the really concrete outcome of seeing students who have not traditionally succeeded succeed
Yeah.
by a variety of metrics. So I think that is just some of what like I really would love to be about.
Yeah.
And really wanting to see that change. Um, so yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I'm just kind of thinking like a lot of people when I ask them about their like uh, challenging stories or adversity stories of maybe teaching moments from their school years, they always talk about their math classes and how
Yeah,
a lot of like the traumas, the academic traumas, kind of come from not being able to perform in these math classes. And so I would I think you kind of talked a little bit about this, about like how you've been addressing student engagement with math in schools and, what you're doing differently to prevent these traumas. But I was wondering if you could sort of share some tangible stories or some very specific things that are happening in the classrooms of teachers that you are training around leading with curiosity and connection, where they're not, experiencing these types of traumas, but they're leading more with, or that, I guess, that your teachers are equipping these students with more confidence and self efficacy rather than like saying, oh, you're not measuring up to these standards or things like that. So if you have any like tangible stories or success stories or things like that.
sure. So we are in the midst of like data collection for some of this
Oh,
work,
yeah.
in particularly in Cambridge, because the district has really incorporated this or implemented this work around complex instruction around the district. So we're in we're in data collection stage. But that said, some of the feedback has been like one from teachers, like their reflections, their anecdotal stories, their surveys, and being able to read the ways in which they are seeing the classroom differently, seeing themselves differently, seeing the art and practice of teaching differently, um, and how they're trying to change. I think some evidence has been like through like some video, like we've been able to
Mm,
collect and watching teachers in the classroom and ways that they've really changed their approaches. Some teachers have interviewed students and we've been able to video some of the student interviews to hear what they're seeing and experiencing. I think we're trying to collect even, I mean, at this stage, like, some grades data, some of the standardized score data, like that'll come. I think I mean, just one story one of the teachers shared at Cambridge Ringe and Latin, so the high school in Cambridge, was by incorporating some of these structures and systems around complex instruction and ways students are working together. One of the tests that she had given in prior years. This year, she said, "Oh, the students actually scored far higher than they ever have, like in contrast to prior years." So she was
mm,
just reflecting on ways that was happening, like even just at the level of like this one test that she may have given prior years, but to see students their engagement. But again, we are in like data collection phase, so it would be
yeah.
really intriguing. It is really hard though with data, not to make an excuse, but
Mm,
it's really hard to move the needle in education. There's so many variables, and it's like, what shifts, what changes the needle. Um, so that's one big question, and a question is like, well, how much are teachers incorporating this method or buying in, and then so some of that definitely is at play with this, and anyway, I think that's some of what we're collecting, anyway, so that's, yeah, it's
mm.
it's it's definitely a work in progress though.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're still in data collection phase, yeah, I totally understand. And so I guess kind of like wrapping up here, I'd love to know a little bit about when we look at your entire journey of starting, in the public schools and then uh, applying to the high school, the private school, and getting a scholarship, and then going through Stanford, and then Harvard, and then being able to teach and train educators in so many different school districts from both all across the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast. Um, I'm just kind of wondering, when you look at your journey of education to career, and to making the impact that you have and continue to do, I'm wondering, is there anything you wish you had learned sooner? Or is there any skill that you wish you could have learned while you were still in school, um, to have either better prepared you for your career or your, I guess, the social impact work that you do now?
Hmm. I appreciate that. One thought that just comes to mind. So I'm 51 right now, and I went to the Harvard doctoral program just 6 years ago. So I was 45. It was a mid-career doctoral program, and their tagline is "Transform Self to Transform Sector," which I really
Mm,
appreciate. So um, I think that has been just so much of the work. I certainly look back at my life, and I mean, we started the podcast about my childhood, and
yeah.
certainly recognizing like from that, I there were many ways that I interacted with people and the work and myself. It related to myself, you know, um, just out of a place of like, it wasn't great. Like I certainly know I had so much anger and
Mm,
and um and really, what led me to the Harvard doctoral program at age 45 was because I call it my midlife crisis doctorate, because it really was this, time of wanting to reevaluate how I was approaching life and work, and seeing that in the midst of fighting, which I do see like the work in education and in the work of social justice, like there is elements of fighting, but wanting to fight better and not being overcome and overtaken by anger. And I certainly recognize that ways in which I had led at Mission High, at other places, my church, my work, my family was really at a place where I needed transformation and I wanted to engage differently. And so I think that is something really at a deep fundamental level of wanting that change. And, very much like this Harvard doctoral program, I feel like the ways people described it was they break you down and build you back up. And it really was that for me. And it was um, an incredible experience with 24 colleagues, this cohort of 25 from around the country who just, arm in arm, we really worked together to build each other up and also call each other out. And it was very much what I needed. So I guess what I wish I'd learned sooner was like, what does it look like to be able to really engage in this like deeper work of transformation? Like if we want transformation within the system, very much recognizing like we ourselves are a system like individually like so we need to transform that system like we need to individually change our like change and transform and what's going to be needed for that and I think it may be very different for each person but anyway wanting to engage in that and I mean the other thing that just comes to mind I think is certainly like learning from so many of the failures and I hope I can when I lead trainings or that I can share these failures too like it's not like all of this was a success story. I certainly made so many mistakes and failed hurt people all of that right like conflict so anyway just ways in which that is part of the learning too. And then what is needed for us to share those stories also because I think that is frequently the biggest learning happens from like our sharing our failures um and then learning from them and then others being able to learn from them as well. So and certainly like in the moment or in the like current state of my life like encountering these failures daily and so
Mm.
what does that look like to be able to own them to address them my favorite Franciscan friar author named Richard Rohr talks about praying for a daily humiliation and not to I think I don't I hope this doesn't sound but more this idea of like, oh, do we learn, right? I mean, I don't mean this to sound like, whatever, harmful to self at all, but more of like, well, what is the learning we're gonna engage in? And we are gonna fail and we are gonna experience humiliation. And that's part of the work. Like I think if we're doing something worthwhile and risky, that's going to be just some of what we encounter along the journey. And so, and then last thing I'll just say is, my colleague Shahara Jackson talks about like, like let's extend grace to grow, like extend to ourselves, grace to grow. Let's just extend it to others. We're all in this journey, and like, what does it look like to be able to offer that to ourselves and to others? So that there is this really safe and vibrant place to experience growth, and we feel like we can. So yeah, those are some reflections. Thank you.
Those were really beautiful reflections. And like the question that I had was when you talk about that anger that you had that you were working through, I'm wondering, like, you don't have to share more, but I do want to know, like, do you think that anger was um, anger towards yourself, or do you think it was anger towards society?
um, well, one, I would just say I hope I've learned to channel the anger towards um, I don't know, I know some people or some faith traditions call it like righteous anger, but I hope that I
Yeah.
have been able to actually channel it in a like a positive,
Yeah.
like for like in a motivating arena, because there are like our society is so messed up. Like there are things that we
Yeah.
have to get angry about, and I
Yeah.
think and so, but it really is a matter of just what do we do with that anger? Where do we channel it?
Yeah.
How do we express it in a productive way that produces the outcomes we want? Whereas I would say
Exactly.
prior, the anger really it controlled me.
Yeah.
So that was much more my history with that anger. I just in terms of your question about where it was directed, I think it probably was directed at both like self and
Yeah.
others and society. I mean, I think, something I'm learning, certainly growing up in the family I did with anger or anger issues around me and my own anger
Yeah.
issues, I think it was very easy to blame, and that I know that
Mm.
um, that's a reflex I have. So to really guard against that,
Sure.
and people close to me, friends or my wife who will call me out on that, like, oh, you're blaming because it's a defense mechanism or it's a your reflex or
Mm.
instinct. But a lot of the work, like I try to lead with educators, is like uh, this work around what's often called discourse one and discourse two, but really from the language of blame to the language of responsibility. Like, it's
Mm.
not we take responsibility, right? Like so. But anyway, so just at that fundamental level, then I need to like I'm implicated in this, so I need to make sure I'm also not blaming, and I need to take responsibility for my actions, for my emotions, for the anger I have, and how am I going to direct that um, productively into the world and channel it hopefully in a productive manner. Maybe I could just offer one quick story that so
Yeah.
with Cambridge, with this like with this language of blame and language of responsibility, it was really intriguing. I had the opportunity to work with the math educators right after school ended, which is a really hard time. So that everyone's exhausted, but
Yeah.
we took up a problem statement and we tried to engage in root cause analysis, this
Mm.
5 why protocol around this problem statement of we are failing our Black students in math. And even that language, the way we phrased it is important. It's not Black students are failing math or Cambridge, the district is failing Black students in math, but really trying to own it. And
Mm.
then also, though, the challenge of that, right, for educators to engage in that, to see how we are responsible. And so, that's something I learned at Mission High, and hopefully it's something I can carry over into my life. But to say, like, where's the place I'm responsible, and what is it all that I can do within my whatever locus of control or whatever, but
Yeah.
really like starting with that question of like, what's my responsibility in this, and what's my where am I implicated in this? So anyway, just that comes to mind of again some of the courageous work that Cambridge is doing, but also I feel very privileged to facilitate and lead. And we'll return to this work in the next school year because certainly it's a long road.
Continuing.
And yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, it's a journey, but thank you so much for sharing that. It was very visually evocative, and I think it nailed in what you were sharing. And so, I guess my very last question to you is, do you have any words of wisdom for the next generation and their parents and educators?
so what comes to mind is just that we need you. We need like the world needs you. We need all of you. I think what comes to mind is just a lot of the work like Rochelle Gutierrez around rehumanizing mathematics, but really this work of saying we need the fullness of all of who you are in this world. We need it in our classrooms. We need it in society. We often just ask students. and each other, educators, to leave so much of ourselves at the door. And what we really need is the fullness of people, all that they bring, all of the richness of their history, their ancestors, like all of this we need to bring in, and we're made better because of it. And we need to learn how to incorporate that fullness into our classroom settings, into our society, into our work with each other. So so I guess my message would be, even though our system often will want to like squash that out or ask you leave this at the door, my ask would be, please bring it. We need you, and we need the fullness of you. Um, the world needs it. We need it. We're made better for it.
Those are brilliant closing words. So I'm going to stop recording. It might take a second to upload everything.